c'est normal. Mhm. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. And thank you, Mrs. President. So, hi everyone. So, thank you for attending my PhD defense. So, my name is Alexis Berny, and I would like to present you my PhD work about numerical study of bursting bubbles at the surface of different liquids. And as Patricia just said, this work was done here at Jean Le Rond d'Alembert with under the supervision of Stéphane and Thomas. And it was done in collaboration with Luc Dijker from Princeton University. So briefly, before talking, I'd like to talk very briefly and very generally about the cycle of water. So when you've got an ocean, some water will evaporate, form some clouds, and then those clouds will evolve, and in the end, eventually they will rain, and this rain will come back to the ocean, fulfilling the cycle of water. So this is a very simplified version. And during this presentation, I would like to focus on the evaporation process. So what's going on the ocean that provokes evaporation. So here you've got one example. On an ocean, you've got a breaking wave. This wave will produce here spume drops, and then during the breakup of this wave, a lot of air is captured below the wave, and it will form, after that, all the white patches you can see behind the wave. So let's summarize a bit this video. So we've got here our breaking wave with the production of spume drop on the top. And then behind this wave, once the air is captured below the wave, this air is mixed due to the ocean turbulence. This mix of air formed a lot of bubbles, and all those bubbles will rise up to the air-ocean interface and will eventually burst, producing a lot of droplets. So now let's zoom to those bubbles. So here we've got a glass of sparkling water. I'm sorry for the quality of the video. And on this glass of water, we've got a lot of bubbles that rise up to the air-water interface. They burst and they produce all the small droplets you can observe above. So what's going on here? So let's now take one single image where we can observe the formation of a jet here and the formation of droplets. And if we observe what causes this jet, we will observe here the bursting bubbles with the formation of a jet and a lot of droplets. So the bursting bubbles process is actually very fast, less than 5 milliseconds. So we need to observe that with high-speed camera. So here this video was shot at 20,000 images per second. So we are observing here the results coming from a bubble of 0.5 millimeter of radius. And by changing the bubble size or the type of liquids, we can explore the whole range of bubbles and how they will burst and how much droplets they will produce, etc., etc. We can already see that small bubbles will be hard to generate and to observe experimentally, since we need to zoom a lot to observe the small bubbles and therefore the small droplet they produce. So that's lead us to our main question. So I mentioned the evaporation coming above the ocean. And the question I would like to try to answer with you today is, from a breaking wave, how much water will evaporate in the air? So to answer this question, we will need several elementary bricks. We start with the fact that we need to characterize the different breaking waves. From those breaking waves, we need to characterize the production of bubbles. From those bubbles, we've seen that they are producing droplets. So we need to characterize the ejection of all the droplets, and that's a part of this PhD. That's something we've done during this PhD. And last, I've mentioned the evaporation. So we need to characterize the evaporation process of the different droplets ejected from bursting bubbles. And of course, when you combine these 4 elementary bricks, we can estimate this amount of water that evaporates in the air. So now, well, I've talked about bursting bubbles. This problem is quite old, actually. So it was studied first in 1953 by Woodcock. So they wanted to characterize already the transfer of matter between the ocean and the air. And the first guess was the bursting bubbles. One of their guesses was the bursting bubbles. So they observe how a bubble below the air-ocean interface bursts. And here you can see the bursting process. And in the end, the formation of a jet. And here we are close to the formation of a droplet at the top of the jet. So they were able to characterize the size of the first ejected droplets and its velocity. However, the experimental technique were not as good as they are today, since we need high-speed camera, high-speed photo, and it was not available at that time, so we made much better experiments right now. So later, in 1994, Spiel, another researcher, performed a different study. He wanted to characterize the size of all the droplets coming from a bursting bubble, and he stopped for the 6 first droplets. So he performed a bursting bubble experiment by changing the size of the bubbles and working on clear water and on ocean water. And he measured the size of the 6 first droplets and the number of ejected droplets coming from bursting bubbles. More recently, so we are coming to the first numerical study performed here at D'Alembert by Laurent Duchemin et al. So he performed the very first experimental study that explored the impact of the initial viscosity on the bursting bubbles, assuming that we are working under the no-gravity assumption. They were able, through this numerical study, to characterize the velocity of the first ejected droplets and the size of the first ejected. However, those numerical studies were a bit limited, well, compared to today, since the numerical technique in 2002 were not as good as they are today as well. So we are moving now to some more recent results coming from our group. So in 2014, Elisabeth Gabache performed bursting bubbles study. So she observed how the collapse of the cavity here, so if we observe here, so how the cavity here will collapse for different type of bubble and different viscosity of liquids in order to characterize the ejection velocity and the size of the different droplets we are producing here from bursting bubbles. And last, the latest results we get from the literature are coming from 2 different research teams. The first one performed by Dijke et al. With our research group. So they performed a numerical study with the software Geris, and they wanted to characterize the impact of the viscosity and the bubble size on the ejection velocity of the first droplet, of the first coming droplet here. And on the same time, Brass et al. Performed also with Geris a set of numerical and experimental bursting bubbles to characterize the size of the first droplet that are ejected by a bursting bubble, as we can see here. So as we can see, so this problem has been already well studied. The first droplet has been characterized by different research teams. But I would like to talk a bit more about this first droplet, because we will introduce our numerical working with Basilisk, which is a new implementation of the Navier-Stokes equation. Then we've seen during all the video before that there are several droplets that are produced by a bursting bubbles. We would like to characterize all the droplets coming from a bursting bubbles. So why so? As I mentioned, I would like to characterize the evaporation of the droplets. So to do that, we need to know what size they are, and then how fast they will move in the air to characterize their evaporation. And in the air, with the combination of our results and the literature, we will go to the evaporation coming from a breaking wave. So first, before showing you some results, we need to initialize our bursting bubble problem. So I start here with an initial shape, a bubble here, below the air-ocean interface. So when you've got a bubble that rises up, the bubble will stay a few seconds, up to a few minutes at the air-ocean interface, at the air-water interface. And this time is actually long enough to consider that the bubble is at rest here below the air interface. This shape is axis symmetric, so basically if you rotate this shape around this red axis, you will obtain the full shape of a bursting bubble, We have here in black the liquid with the viscosity of the liquid and the density of the liquid. And in white, we've got the air with its viscosity and its density. We note J, the action of gravity, or the radius of the bubble, and gamma, the surface tension between the air and the liquid. You can observe here on this shape a small green. This line corresponds to the small liquid film that is between the bubble and the air. And we will assume that this liquid film will not impact the bursting bubble process, so we will simulate only the black and white shape. This problem is fully characterized by 4 dimensionless parameters, so you've got them all here. We start with the density ratio and the viscosity ratio, comparing the density and viscosity of air with the density viscosity of the liquid. Those ratios are taken close to the density and viscosity ratio of air in water, and they are high enough to consider that they will not impact the bursting bubble process. We will assume that they stay constant during the this entire presentation, and we will not change them at all. We then introduce the Laplace number here. This number is comparing the capillary forces on the top with the viscous forces on the bottom. You can see this number as a Reynolds number, with gamma over mu being the capillary velocity. This number for bubbles coming from breaking waves will be between 500 and 500,000. Now, I'm talking about the bond number here, the last dimensionless number. This number is comparing the gravitational forces on the top with the capillary forces on the bottom. And for the bubbles coming from a breaking waves, the bond number will be between 10 to the minus 3 to 1. So as you can see here, with the value of our 2-dimensionless number, the capillary forces are the main forces during this process. So we will be completely driven by the capillarity. During the next slides, I will only mention the variation of the Laplace number, and I will only consider bond number, very low bond number, below 5, 10 to the minus 2. So we will assume that the gravity is not impacting first. We will completely neglect the action of gravity and only focus on the Laplace number. So now we can introduce the dimensionless equation we will solve during our numerical simulation. We will solve the dimensionless Navier-Stokes equation with, on the top, the momentum conserving equation. On the left-hand side, you've got here the acceleration term, and here the advection term. And on the right-hand side, you've got the different forces. So here, the pressure forces, the viscous forces here, assuming we're working with a Newtonian fluids. Here, we've got the capillary forces, so the forces at the interface, which involve the capillarity. And last, we've got here the gravity forces with our bond number. The second equation corresponds to the continuity equation, assuming we are working with incompressible fluid. Then we have 2 equations here that give us the density and the viscosity of the liquid with the introduction of a new variable here, C. C is just a fluid tracer equal to 1 in the liquid phase and 0 in the gas phase. And last, we've got the mass conserving equation working on the fluid tracer C. So that's for the introduction of the dimensionless equation, and we will solve this equation with Basilisk. So Basilisk is actually a numerical solver developed here at D'Alembert. And the advantage of Basilisk upon Jeris is that the implementation of the Navier-Stokes equation is new and faster than Jeris. The idea of Basilisk is to solve this equation on a volume of fluid mesh. So you've got here an example of such a mesh, and this mesh can deal with two-phase flow. Why so? So here you've got an interface. So we've got some liquids here in gray and some air in white. The fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is only gas.
The fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is
only
the
gas.
fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is the fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is the fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is the fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is the fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is the fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is the fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is the fluid pressure is equal to 0 in the cells where there is
to adapt itself at this time step to adapt capture the region of time step and it allows to have a very nice for a low gravitation also. We will adapt this mesh based on the interface. We will adapt to capture this mesh based on the interface. We will adapt good precision, and we also adapt this mesh on the velocity gradient in order to capture where the velocity is the highest. So now let's observe how a simulation behaves from the mesh point of view. So we've got here our simulation. So we've got liquid here in black, the air here. The colors represent the density of the mesh. The more you are red, the higher you've got, the more cell you have in the region. And you can observe how the simulation behaves with the adaptation of the mesh on the interface and the characterization of the high velocity part. So let's observe again this simulation, but this time without the mesh, just to observe a bit more the physics and what's going on inside the bursting bubbles process. So we've got here again our bubble. We can observe the collapse of the cavity with the propagation of a capillary wave here inside the cavity. And those capillary waves will focus at the bottom of the interface. It will form a jet in the bottom. This jet will rise and it will eventually break up, forming several droplets. And each time we are ejecting a droplet, we measure its velocity and we measure its size. And we also, of course, count the number of droplets we are ejecting. So let's measure the ejection velocity of the first drop. So I'm taking here 3 simulations at 3 different Laplace numbers. So we've got here the Laplace number plotted on the x-axis. We are plotting on the y-axis the dimensionless velocity of ejection of the first droplet here for 3 Laplace numbers, 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000. If we try to understand a bit more, we try to measure the velocity for an air bubble in water. We've got here a Laplace number of 1,000 correspond to a very small air bubble, approximately 13 micrometers, sorry. And the ejection velocity of the first drops will be equal to 700 km per hour, which is a very fast droplet. If now we move on to a Laplace number of 10,000, the initial bubble will be bigger, and we've got this time an ejection velocity of only 100 km per hour. And last, if we observe a Laplace number of 100,000, we've got an initial bubble at 1.3 millimeter with an ejection velocity of only 12.4 km per hour. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we are not the only one who've done that. So I will take the results from the literature, so the experimental results from Elisabeth Gabash. So she observed with a high-speed camera the ejection velocity of the first droplet, here with the orange points. And I'm also taking the numerical results from Dijker et al. So they observed the ejection velocity of the first drop here in green. What we can observe on this curve is something very counterintuitive. In fact, indeed, when we are increasing the viscosity of the liquid, we are increasing the ejection velocity of the first drop. So this is counterintuitive, since when you increase the viscosity, you should expect a decrease in the velocity of the fluids. So what's going on inside the fluid? So let's observe. Let's take again our numerical simulation, and let's observe what's going on inside. So I'm starting here with 2 Laplace numbers, 1,000 and 100, and 100,000. And I'm plotting the shape of those bubbles. So the bubbles here are represented with the same size so that we can clearly compare them. The colors of the shape will represent the time steps. So the more we are close to the red, the more we're close to a time equal to 1. So let's observe how those simulations behave. So we start here with the initial collapse. And we observe the different time steps. And here what we can see, on a very high Laplace number, so very low viscosity, we are observing the propagation of a lot of capillary waves inside the bubble cavity. If we increase the viscosity, we observe here on a Laplace of 1000 that there is absolutely no capillary wave. There is in fact only one capillary wave. So in fact, the viscosity is damping the amplitude of the capillary waves, which explain why we've got here only one main capillary wave. And if we observe the jet formation, here at a Laplace of 100,000, we can observe the formation of a jet. This jet is very thick and very slow. And if we compare that with a Laplace number of 1000, we've got a very fast jet and very thin jet. So that explains why we are producing fastest droplet at a low Laplace number. So that explains why increasing the viscosity increase the ejection velocity of the first drop. And now we can, of course, observe the rest of the simulation and the production of all the droplets. So now we understand why those results behave like that. So we, of course, perform a numerical study as well. So we explore the entire range of Laplace number in order to complete the results from this curve. So we recover, of course, the result from the literature, and we also expand the results with here an observation of a maximum velocity at a Laplace number of 1000. So we've done here the ejection velocity of the first drop. Now we can go to the ejection velocity, to the size of the first drop. So again, we're observing here on the x-axis the Laplace number of the simulation, and on the y-axis the dimensionless size of our droplet. So we are measuring the size. So we've got here again our three simulations, 1000, 10,000, and 100,000. And again, if we measure the size of the droplet, we are starting here with a bubble of 30 micrometer, and we're ejecting a drop at 0.1 micrometer, which is a very, very small droplet. If we increase the Laplace number, we are increasing the bubble size, and we are increasing as well the droplet size. And again, with a bubble at 1.3 millimeter. We can observe that the ejection that the size of the upcoming droplet, of the first drop, sorry, is increasing faster than the size of the initial bubble. So again, we've got some results coming from the literature with the experimental results from Elisabeth Gabash, and two sets of results from Brass et al. So Brass performed a numerical study with Geris, here with the purple points, and an experimental study in microfluidics with here the green points. They observe as well something that may seem counterintuitive, but again, we've seen that the very high Laplace number are producing thick and slow jet, which explain why we've got biggest droplet here than here at low Laplace number. So the capillary waves are again behind the size of the first droplet. So as well, we explore the full range of the Laplace number. So we have explored 3 orders of magnitude in the Laplace number. And in terms of size, we're exploring here, as we can see, 4 orders of magnitudes. So the Laplace number seems to be very important to characterize the size of the first droplet. And as a conclusion for this part, we have characterized the first droplet with a new numerical method called Basilisk. We've seen that by sweeping the Laplace number on 3 different orders of magnitude here, we are exploring 3 orders of magnitude in the velocity, which means that the Laplace number is important in the ejection velocity of the first drop. And we are exploring 4 orders of magnitude in the size of the first drop, which means that the Laplace number is the important parameter. I haven't taken into account the gravity here. If you do so, you will see that the gravity will only act as a correction factor on the ejection velocity and a very small correction on the first drop size. So that's confirmed that the main parameter will be the Laplace number and not the bond number. So now that we have characterized the size of the first drop, well, I would like to characterize all the other drops coming from a bursting bubble process. So let's start by counting and estimating how many droplets are ejected. So we start again with our three simulations, 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000. And we observe that for the low Laplace number, we are producing between 8 and 10 drops, which is a lot. And if you increase the Laplace number, we are only producing 4 droplets. Now, if we explore the whole range of Laplace number, we can observe that we've got a maximum of ejected droplets here, 14 droplets for a Laplace number of 1,500 approximately. So this maximum here, again, this is due to the capillary waves. And then as you increase the Laplace number, you decrease the number of ejected droplets. Now, so we have estimated the number of ejected droplets. Let's now characterize their velocity. So we are measuring here the ejection velocity of the second droplets coming just after the first one. As you can see, the behavior of the second droplet is the same than the behavior of the first droplet. Another important point is that the ejection velocity of the second droplet is a bit slower than the ejection velocity of the first drop. If we observe now the ejection of the third droplet, again, we have the same behavior with a lower velocity compared to the first drop. And again, we do so for the fourth droplet. We observe the same behavior than the first drop with a lower velocity. So if we compare them all, we have the same behavior for the first droplet with a lower velocity. So very briefly, by hands, what's going on? When the jet is ejected, the jet has its initial velocity, and then the jet is slowed down at the top by the capillary retraction of the jet. So that explains why we've got a decrease in the ejection velocity, very briefly, by hands. So we've done the velocity for the first droplet. Of course, you can do that for all the other droplets. So now let's measure the size of the upcoming drop. So I'm starting with the dimensionless size of the second drops, plotted as a function of the Laplace number. And again, for the second droplets, we can observe that we've got exactly the same behavior than the first drop, with approximately the same size. We're staying around the size of the second droplet, of the first droplet. If we observe the third droplet, again, we have the same behavior for the size, and we stay roughly around the size of the first droplet. And this conclusion applies as well for the fourth droplet. So what we can observe here is that for the first droplet, so we've done here only the first, but we can do all of them up to 14, remember. We observe that the size of the first droplet seems to be the same, with approximately the same behavior. So that's to conclude this part concerning the number and the size of all the droplets. We have characterized the velocity, we have characterized the size, and we have seen that the first droplet follow the same behavior than the first ejected droplet. We have observed a slower velocity of ejection for the droplet 2 to 4 compared to the first one. And we have observed that the size stays roughly the same. We have also counted the number of droplets, and we have seen that there is a maximum of ejected droplet close to a Laplace of 1,500. So here we have characterized all the droplets. So I've only shown you the first droplets, but we have characterized all the droplets. Now we can estimate their evaporation in order to, in the end, work with a breaking wave, and in order to, in the end, characterize the evaporation coming from a breaking wave. So let's move on to the evaporation. So when a droplet is ejected from here, our water pool, this droplet will be subject to the Newton's second law. So this is how the droplet will behave. So we've got here the dynamic term, and this droplet will be subject to two forces, the drag forces here, and the gravity forces. The mass of the droplet will evolve in time. Since this droplet will evaporate, how do we characterize the evaporation of the droplet? Well, by using the evaporation law called the D2 evaporation law. So this evaporation characterizes the evolution of the radius of the droplet, the square radius of the droplet, as a function of two parameters. So the first one here is the evaporation parameter, minus 2 times J naught. What is important to remember about J naught is that it's only a function of the diffusion coefficient and the humidity in the air. And I will not go into the details for this parameter. And there is here another parameter called due to a boundary layer. So this droplet is evaporating. Since this droplet is in motion, this generates a boundary layer behind this around this droplet, and this droplet will only evaporate inside this boundary layer. And this boundary layer for the evaporation is a function of the drop size and the drop velocity. So what we can see here, we've got two equations. The evaporation equation is a function of the drop size, but this is expected, and the drop velocity. And the velocity of the drop is a function of the drop size and the drop velocity. So we've got a coupled system here. And if you solve this system, you can observe how the drop will behave. So the drop will rise up and then goes gently down while evaporating. If we play the small video, you can see that the drop is rising up and then evaporating during the whole flight. I'm recalling here our two dimensionless parameters, the Laplace number and the bond number. We've seen that the Laplace number is very important for the drop size and the drop velocity. And we're observing here in our equation that we've got the gravity that is back. So maybe the gravity might be important during the evaporation process. So that's what we will try to characterize, what we will try to observe. But first, let's observe the evaporation of the first drop. So I'm plotting here the evaporation of the first drop as compared to the initial volume of the bubble. And I'm plotting that as a function of the Laplace number. I'm assuming here a bond number of 10 to the minus 2. And we will only focus on this bond number for now. We're observing here the evaporation of our first drop with a sort of plateau here for the high Laplace number and a decrease here. In the literature, everyone says that the evaporation of the first drop is dominant and the evaporation of the droplet coming after the first one is negligible. Well then, let's observe the evaporation of the second droplet. And as you can see, the evaporation of the second droplet is in fact the same order of magnitude than the evaporation of the first drop. So, well, we shouldn't stop at the evaporation of the second droplet, and let's observe the evaporation of the drop number 3 here compared to the evaporation of drop number 1, and we again stay roughly in the same order of magnitude. Let's observe now drop number 4. So again, droplet number 4 evaporates in the same order of magnitude than droplet number 1. So if we plot them all together, we can see that they are all in the same range. So since we can now assume that all the droplets are important, we can sum up their evaporation. So I've worked here with a bond number of 10 to the minus 2. So let's just observe the evaporation of all the droplets, the sum of the evaporation of all the droplets compared to the bubble volume, function of the Laplace number here, and for a bond number of 10 to the minus 2, which is our color here. We observe that if you change the Laplace number, the evaporation of all the droplets seems to be quite constant. If now we change the bond number, so we will change the bond number from 10 to the minus 3 to 1, and this is kind of magic. As you can see, as you change the bond number, you completely change the evaporation. As you increase the bond number, so as you increase the gravity, it evaporates less and less water compared to the initial bubble volume. What is important here is to see that as you change the bond number, you also keep constant. The Laplace number is not impacting the evaporation process. So that will be our conclusion for this evaporation process. So we have built a very simple coupled model for the evaporation of the droplet. We've seen, and this is very important, this is very new, that the evaporation of all the droplets is important, and we use here our numerical results. And we have seen also that the Laplace number seems to not impact the evaporation process of all the droplets. So we've characterized the droplets. We have built an evaporation model. So now we can move on to an evaporation coming from a breaking wave. And from these breaking waves, there is some subsidiary questions. The first one is how many drops are ejected from a breaking wave? And the second one is what is the ejected mass coming from a breaking waves? So let's start by our 4 elementary bricks. We have done during this PhD the characterization of the droplet and the evaporation model. We will take now from the literature the characterization of the bubbles coming from a breaking wave in order to answer our main question, how much water evaporates. So let's start by the breaking waves characterization. So I'm taking results coming from the literature. So I've got here breaking waves from Dean and Stokes. they worked experimentally with a channel. They propagate a wave in this channel, and they observe how this wave here will propagate, breaks up here, capturing some air, how this air will be mixed below the wave and forming all those bubbles here. And then they count here the number of bubbles, and they estimate the size of those bubbles and how many bubbles there is for each size. So they were able to get those results. So they performed 14 times these experiments in order to get some statistically converged results. And they were able to build a scaling law for the number for the number of produced per cube meter of breaking waves. So we can observe that a breaking wave is producing a lot of small bubbles, and as you increase the bubble size, you are decreasing the number of bubbles that you produce. I'm now going back to our results. We have bubbles. We need to characterize how many droplets are ejected. So I'm taking here again our numerical results. As you can see, those results are a bit noisy, actually. So we need to perform a statistical characterization of the bubble size, of the number of ejected droplets for different bubble size. So this is what we've done here. So we've performed for several bubble size a statistical study by changing a little bit the initials. And for each bubble size, we count the number of ejected droplets. And I'm plotting the distribution for each bubble size here with the box plot. So in orange, you've got the median value, meaning that you've got the value of that. So we've got here our median value. Then the boxes here correspond to the center of the distribution. So you've got 50% of the distribution inside the boxes, and then the mustache you've got above that represent the entire range of the number of ejected distribution for each bubble size. So to characterize the number of ejected droplets, I will only consider the statistical distribution here, and by doing a convolution between each distribution for each bubble size, we get the number of ejected droplets for a given bubble radius. So we've got the bubble, we've got the number of ejected droplets. We then need to statistically characterize their size. So again, here for each bubble size, we can measure the droplet size. And this is what I'm putting here, distribution of the droplet size as a function of the radius of the droplet. So here we've got our entire distribution for a bubble of approximately 0.2 millimeter of radius, with a peak here for a bubble for a droplet of approximately 20 micrometers. So distribution has a peak here, and then we spread around this peak. What is important to say is that we've done that for several bubble size. This gives us the distribution function, or if you take a slice of this distribution, the probability to get a droplet in this range. And of course, if you sum all the probability, you get a probability equal to 1 to have a droplet in this range. When we perform that for different bubble size, and then by interpolating this function between the different bubble size, you get a function giving you the probability to get a droplet of size R drop for a bubble of size R bubble. So now we can move on to a breaking wave. We've got three functions: the number of produced bubbles, the number of ejected droplets for a bubble size, for a given bubble size, and the distribution of droplet size for a bubble size. We convolute those three functions, so basically we multiply them all together, and by integrating them from 0 to infinity, so to all the bubble size range, we get the number of ejected droplets as a function of the drop radius. And if we plot this distribution, we get these results. So we are observing here how much droplets are ejected as a function of the droplet size per cube meter per wave. We observe here a maximum of ejected droplets at approximately 1 micrometer. So in fact, and we've got approximately 11 millions of droplets. So the droplet that dominates in the breaking waves, the droplet that are the most produced, are the very small one at 1 micrometer. And then, as you increase the droplet size, you are decreasing the number of ejected droplets. In total, from our breaking wave, we are producing approximately 250 million droplets. This is actually quite a lot, since we produce only 20 millions of bubbles. So we might I will come to that later. From this number of ejected droplets, we can compute the ejected mass. And as you can see here, despite having a lot of very small droplets at 1 micrometer, the droplets that dominate in the ejected mass are the biggest one, around 0.1 millimeter of radius. And if you sum all the mass we are ejecting 1.3 kilograms of water per cube meter of breaking waves. So that's also quite a lot. If you take 1 square meter of breaking waves, this will mean that you will have a layer of 1 millimeter of water ejected above the breaking wave. And if you imagine you have that for every breaking wave, well, this might be a lot. And if you've been to the ocean, you've never seen so much water above the ocean. We can now combine these results with our evaporation results. And if we plot that, we are observing that we are evaporating approximately 0.1 kilograms of water per breaking waves. We are observing also from this curve that the biggest droplets are the one that dominates. And also, you observe that all the small droplets completely evaporate, which is not the case for the biggest one, where you only evaporate a part of the big droplets. So as a conclusion from this part, we have built a model that allows us to characterize the number of ejected droplets coming from a breaking wave, the mass, the ejected mass, and the amount of water that evaporates from this mass. If now I'm zooming out a bit from this PhD, we have built a numerical simulation with Basilisk that allows us to characterize all the drops coming from a bursting bubble process. And we have seen, by using a very simple evaporated model, that the evaporation of all the droplets matter in the evaporation. So we cannot neglect the droplet coming after the first one in the evaporation process. And last, we have estimates. We have built a model to characterize all the droplets coming from a breaking waves. So there was, of course, a few limitations for our models. So concerning the breaking wave, we've seen that there is probably an overestimation on the ejected drops. So the one first reason concerning this overestimation is that when you consider the bubbles below the air-ocean interface, we assume that all the bubbles will rise up and burst, producing droplets. However, those bubbles may interact with each other when they are below the water, so they can form, they can merge together, they can separate. We can also observe that bubbles will form some raft at the surface of the ocean. So this is currently the research topic of Baptiste Neal in Princeton. He's trying to understand how the bubbles interact with each other when they form raft. And a last limitation, the bubbles are forming foam at the surface of the ocean. So this is the white patches you can observe below on these images here. When the bubble bursts in the foam, the bubble will not eject any water since there is no liquid above that. And you may have already encountered such a bursting bubbles. If you take a glass of beer, well, you've got a lot of foam, and here all the bubbles that burst above the glass of beer will not eject any droplets. If you take a glass of beer later, you may put your nose above the glass of beer, and you will never felt any droplets. You can also do another experiment. You can take a glass of sparkling water, and you will feel a lot of droplets that will tingle your nose, which is not the case here from this delicious beverage. Some other limitation concerning the evaporation process. So we have built a very simple model, but in this model we have completely neglected how the water vapor concentration will evolve above the ocean. We assume that this water vapor concentration stays constant, but well, if you've been to the ocean, you know that the concentration, that the humidity is very high, close to 1. We also assumed a motionless air for all the drops. So that might be true in the lab frame for the first ejected droplet. But when you go to the ocean, there is a lot of winds. And these winds may completely change the behavior of the droplets in the air. Then, another assumption, we assumed that we've got a direct thermal equilibrium between the air and the droplet. We assume that the droplet will directly evaporate at thermal equilibrium. This is well, there is some cool-down process due to the evaporation. There is a transient time, which may limit the evaporation process. And last, we also neglect the surface tension and the salinity of water in our evaporation model. Some openings. So with this work, we have characterized droplets coming from bursting bubbles from the jet that form at the bottom of the bubble cavity. However, remember, I said that we are neglecting the thin liquid film between the bubble and the air. So this liquid film, when this film breaks up, may produce some film drops. So we worked here with a 2D axisymmetric simulation, so we need to move on to 3D simulations to characterize those film droplets. Point, we've seen that changing the viscosity during the evaporation process is not changing at all the evaporation. So there might be some quantity that are conserved during the evaporation. So we might want to perform an energetical study just to characterize what quantity are conserved before the evaporation process. So we've already set up the simulation for the film attraction. So now we need to perform a parameter study to characterize the film droplets formation from this bursting bubbles and from this liquid film attraction. And I would like to let you with this 3D run of a bursting bubble process. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. I will take your question.